Hey y'all, I'm Frostbite, self-proclaimed lobotomy corporation fanatic and fighting game fan. Take a wild guess as to which two fighting games. The answer may shock you. I am one of two bozos here to help Lynn explain the magical girls to you, so hopefully you can actually understand what I'm talking about half the time.
I'm another voice.
First, let's establish, who are the magical girl abnormalities? If you're watching this video, hopefully you already have a rough idea of who they are, so we don't need to spend too much time on each individual abnormality. But basically, the magical girl abnormalities are the four magical girls: the Queen of Hatred, the King of Greed, the Knight of Despair, and the Servant of Wrath, plus the Jester of Nihil, who isn't really a magical girl. The magical girls all used to fight to protect their kingdom, but were eventually overcome and consumed by different desires. The Queen of Hatred, also known as the magical girl of love, is the newest magical girl and the abnormality who embodies the typical image of a magical girl the most. This is probably because her self-worth is entirely dependent on her identity as a magical girl fighting for justice. If her sense of purpose or worth is threatened, she goes crazy, becomes a big evil snake, and beams everyone to death before forgetting everything that happened. The King of Greed, also known as the magical girl of happiness, fought for the sake of everyone's happiness. Insane. One day, she thought that maybe she deserved to be happy too. That pursuit of happiness became an obsession and turned into greed, which developed into a brightly coloured gem. She devoured everything around her before sealing herself in a big eggfish thing, which is probably related to that gem. Then she hatches and ruins it and punches you to death. Yippee! The Knight of Despair, also known as the magical girl of justice, and also known as the best one, upheld honor and, well, justice. Insane. She tried to protect the kingdom she loved so dearly, but as it began to crumble and people changed, she realized that she hadn't really been protecting anything at all. She still clings to her hollow pride as a knight, trying to protect even one person. When she fails, she is overcome by the despair inside her, and trying to dull the pain, she shares that despair with others through her swords. The Servant of Wrath, previously the magical girl of courage, doesn't have friends. She believed in seeing all others equally and fairly, but her loneliness led to her making an exception. She made friends with an otherworldly visitor, the Hermit of the Azure Forest. The Hermit exploited the magical girl of courage, using her to gather secrets about the kingdom before ultimately defeating Courage and destroying the kingdom. The Servant of Wrath is stuck in the past, seeing connection as a breach of her duty and recreating the events of the betrayal she suffered. The Jester of Nihil, also known as the Jester of Nihil, is confusing. We'll come back to them later. As some of you may already know, the magical girls are all themed around a French-suited deck of cards, with the Queen representing hearts, the King representing diamonds, the Knight representing spades, and the Servant representing clubs, and the Jester of Nihil representing the Joker. That's not the only theme that the magical girl abnormalities are linked to, though, especially with all the new Limbus content basically ramming it in our faces and screaming at us to get the idea that the magical girls are more significantly inspired by tarot cards. If you don't know what tarot cards are, they're basically super old playing cards that became used for divination. They're all over popular media like the Persona series, the Quarry, Balatro, and so on. A tarot deck is composed of two main types of cards, being the minor and major arcana. Minor arcana are similar to a typical French-suited deck of cards that you're used to, and describe daily occurrences. Major arcana are much better known, including cards like the Lovers, Death, and the World. The major arcana describe major life events that a person goes through on their journey to completeness. The journey begins with the Fool and ends with the World, before returning to the start, the journey beginning once again as they learn and grow even further, reaching a new level with each cycle. In terms of a tarot deck, the Queen of Hatred is the Queen of Cups, a minor arcana. The King of Greed is the King of Pentacles, a minor arcana. The Knight of Despair is the Knight of Swords, a minor arcana. The Servant of Wrath is the Page of Wands, you've guessed it, a minor arcana. The Jester of Nihil is the Fool, a major arcana. And the Hermit of the Azure Forest from the Servant of Wrath story is the Hermit, another major arcana. On a bit of a tangent for a second, it's a little bit weird that the Servant of Wrath isn't called the Page of Wrath. While tarot cards often have multiple names, the Page's alternate names are usually the Knave or the Princess. The Knave is kind of interesting, because that means that the Page is the equivalent of a Jack in a French suited playing deck. But Knave and Princess both don't really make sense to be translated to servant. Pages acted sort of like servants to knights, think of Sancho to Don Quixote. So maybe the name servant was a translation that didn't account for the name's roots in tarot. Or they just thought that Page of Wrath would sound really stupid. Who knows?
While the major arcana characters seem very linked to their tarot counterparts, the minor arcana magical girls only seem like they might be linked to their class, Queen, King, Knight, Page, and not so much the suit they're a part of. While tarot cards can all have many different interpretations, there is usually a general consensus on roughly what each card means, which magical girls do not follow. For example, the Page of Wands is associated with creativity and passion, which doesn't really feel fitting for a judge character who tries to see everyone equally, and the Knight of Swords is all about energy and great ambition, which seems pretty unrelated to the Knight of Despair too. On the other hand, the magical girls embody negative or maybe reversed versions of the classes. When a card is reversed, its meaning is usually flipped or changed to have a negative connotation. The Page represents youth and innocence, which might link to how the Servant of Wrath was deceived by a much older figure they trusted, and why they're a baby. The Knight often represents change, which the Knight of Despair is constantly fighting against in her story. And the King represents authority and a desire for impact on the world, like how the King of Greed initially wanted to bring happiness to the whole world before devouring authority, riches, and corruption. The Queen represents nurturing and inner strength or emotional maturity. The Queen of Hatred wanted to love everything in the world, but she is incredibly insecure and unstable. On a side note, while I'm not sure if Knight of Despair or Servant of Wrath have references to anything in particular, Queen of Hatred and King of Greed both have references that are worth looking into. Thank you, WOWWW. The Queen of Hatred's final move, Arcana Slay, is a reference to the Dragon Slave move from Slayers, having a similar name and similar chant before it's cast. The main character of Slayers is Luna Inverse. This might be the reason for the reference because of the significance of the inversion in the magical girls' stories, especially to the idea of reversing cards in tarot. I haven't actually watched the show, but apparently Luna is an arrogant young girl with an enormous ego, and is sort of deluded about her grandeur, while other people see her as a menacing criminal. Sounds familiar. Luna is also accompanied by Naga the Serpent. It's a bit of a stretch, but I haven't been able to find a clear reason for why the Queen of Hatred turns into the snake. Maybe it's because of Naga?
The King of Greed references Gustav Mahler's Symphony No. 3, which has the lyrics Tief ist irre Lust, tiefer Nost als Hirseleit, wer spricht, Virgi, doch alle Lust will Ewigkeit, will tiefe Ewigkeit, which translated to English is pretty much the same as the quote from The King of Greed.
Boom.
Deep is the sorrow of the world, greed deeper still than agony. Sadness says, begone, pass away, but greed seeks eternity, seeks deep, deep eternity. Yes, I pronounced that wrong, but I mean, have you looked at me? My specialty is clearly command grabs, not German.
However, in most English translations of the original song, the word lust is translated as joy instead of greed. I don't know German, but in Google Translate, lust is translated as pleasure or desire. The significance here might be to show just how close happiness and greed are. The desire for happiness was an inherently evil desire, something that just caused it to go too far, corrupting the magical goal of happiness. We'll talk more on that later. The King of Greed's design also references the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I. Aside from looking cool and also being known as Lady in Gold, I'm not super sure why this painting in particular was chosen. It could be as simple as the painting looked creepy and inspired the art team. The only things I found by looking at the wiki were that Frank Whitford suggests that the gold is used to remove Adele Bloch-Bauer from the earthly plane, transform the flesh and blood into an apparition, from a dream of sensuality and self-indulgence. And everyone else thinks it's a porno. There's not a lot actually confirmed about the magical girls or the world they come from, but there's a lot of things we can guess, or that have been confirmed by the Queen of Hatred because she does not shut up, and we are so grateful for that. We don't get told very much about the realm that the magical girls come from. From the stage backgrounds in Rona, we see a modern city for hatred, a much older city of spires for despair, the instead of some important building for greed, and a modern city covered in acidic sludge and rubble for wrath. These backgrounds might not be canon to the magical girls whatsoever, but assuming that the books they're sleeping in provide an environment suitable to them, there's a good chance that these backgrounds all resemble, or have some significance to the magical girls. Based on that, the magical girls probably existed at a fairly modern time, but they may have been around for ages if Night of Despair stages depicting much older sort of settlement. We know Queenie is the youngest, so if the magical girls were protecting their kingdoms across centuries, it wouldn't be too odd for Despair, who is afraid of changing things to her past, to think of her city as it was centuries ago, while Queenie's memory of the city is a much newer one. Meanwhile, Greed thinks of some authoritative building, perhaps where she held power and prestige during her descent into greed, and Wrath, tormented by conflict with the Hermit, thinks of the city that was brought to ruin due to that mistake.
In the Night of Despair's story, we see that she used to protect the king of her city. She is also repeatedly referred to as a knight, whereas Queen of Hatred, King of Greed, and Servant of Wrath are actually never referred to as any of their titles. We can probably surmise from this that Despair was actually knighted, and that's why she clings to her pride as a knight so desperately, and upholds the laws of God in the pursuit of valor, chivalry, and justice. The mention of these traits, God, knighthood, and a king, make it seem like Night of Despair was probably made a magical girl during a medieval time period. God is also capitalized in this quote, which might mean that the kingdom was Christian or another Abrahamic religion, or had a similar sort of religion. The city that the magical girls protect isn't the only city in their world, or at least the only civilization, because the Night of Despair had to protect the state, implying other governing bodies somewhere else in the world. The Servant of Wrath's flavor text says that the Hermit of the Azure Forest was an enemy of her realm, which could mean that the Hermit came from another kingdom. However, the Hermit does say that they're a visitor from another world, and Wrath calls them sinners of the other worlds. This could mean that the world that the magical girls are from is like a multiverse or multi-planet kind of thing, maybe even mirror worlds, with arcana present across all of them. Another interpretation would be that this is the Servant of Wrath's perception of the Hermit and her minions, who came to destroy the Servant's world in a more metaphorical sense, and she's alienating them. While the Hermit does literally say she's from another world, it's important to note that we never actually encounter the Hermit in Wonderlab or Ruiner. The Hermit that we see is a recreation of the Hermit that the Servant of Wrath creates as she relives her past within her book. This could be part of why the Hermit's design in the card art is different from the Hermit that appears when Wrath is raging. The version of the Hermit which Wrath summons has much more monstrous eye patterns on their cloak than the Hermit we see in the card art depicting their past. This could show Wrath's recreation of the Hermit being more evil, or maybe the Hermit's cloak changed when she turned on Wrath, or maybe it was just an oversight. Finally, with the magical girls gone, it appears that the city of the magical girls is sort of similar to the city run by the head. In King of Greed's story, there's a diary entry from someone who says that everyone is healthy, but they have ill souls for which there is no therapy anymore. People no longer believe or hope for miracles, although people secretly wish for a hero. This sounds suspiciously a lot like the disease of the human mind that Carmen tried to cure. The diary also says that the people all remember the heroes who tried to change the world, but met their downfall, their desires dragging them into despair. Rip the magical girls. El Bozo. I wonder how they were trying to change the world. The resolution found by the magical girls during their realization is when they find it in themselves to hope, so maybe it was just as simple as allowing the world to hope. And just as a side note, I love how this matches up with Tifereth and the themes of her realization so much.
Through Don Quixote, Queenie tells us that her world is pervaded by a magic force called arcana. Arcana is a neutral force which can be used by both good and evil. We don't know much about how arcana magic works, but through Queenie's announcer dialogue in Limbus, it seems like it is influenced a bit by how tarot cards are read. She has a few lines which refer to a spread. When reading tarot cards, the spread is the format in which cards are drawn and laid out. You then read the spread to divine the future or whatever. For the context of arcana magic, they probably use spread in the sense of each time cards are drawn and read. The arcana may use something similar during battle to enhance their magic or activate powers. When the enemies are buffed, Queenie says that arcana spread must be enhanced by a powerful suggestion, whereas when they're debuffed, she says, reversed? That must be it. I doubt the villains expected this either. Reversed refers to how tarot cards are read differently when they're drawn upside down in a spread, often having the opposite meaning. In the case of the arcana magic system, it seems like people have some kind of spread or drawing like a reading, and the results of that spread can affect their power greatly, powering them up or having the opposite effect if drawn reversed. The magic system is literally gambling. The other two times Queenie mentions the spread are when an enemy activates a special move. The arcana are down to their final spread, and upon breaking an abnormality part, you destroy the arcanum central to the spread. It will start growing weaker now. This basically confirms that the arcana draw their power from spreads, and use them kind of like special moves. But what's an arcanum? It sounds like the arcanum is a part of an arcana that allows them to use their spreads or magic or whatever, but that's the only time Queenie mentions it. Maybe the arcanum is something like a magical girl's magic charm or some artifact thing, or maybe it's an innate part of the body. The Don Quixote Love and Hate ID also references tarot readings in her hysteric status, regressive transformation, reversed. This supports the idea that the corrupted forms of the magical girls are like reversed readings of the cards, flipped to take their concepts in a negative light. For some reason, Roger's Sword Sharpened with Tears ID doesn't have any mention of being reversed. The enemies that the magical girls fight are called minor and major arcana, referring to the two types of tarot cards. When Queenie encounters a Valve abnormality, she says, that one's as strong as a minor arcana, and upon encountering an Aleph, she says, it has the strength of a major arcana. All of the magical girls are Valve, so we can probably assume that they would be minor arcana like their card counterparts if they weren't magical girls. Meanwhile, characters like the Hermit and the Jester would probably be A-list if we ever encountered them. These terms could apply maybe to arcana users who aren't evil, but Queenie calls her enemies arcana scum, so the term is probably used only for evildoers, or maybe arcana wielders are all evil aside from the magical girls. Magical girls are people who can withstand the arcana's corrupting allure, and are selected by a great will, in the choosing, to become warriors of justice. There might not be a way to tell what this great will is yet, but the two options that come to mind are either a being that takes after the world at the end of the tarot journey, or the fool at the start of it, in other words, the Jester of Nihil. We don't know much about the Jester, and there hasn't been any mention of a world tarot at all, but the Jester's flavor text asks the question of whether the Jester created the magical girls, or the magical girls created the Jester. This could be referring to the corrupted forms of the magical girls, but if it refers to their original forms, then the Jester could definitely be the source of this choosing, even if they aren't aware of it. Even Queenie says that she has no idea how the choosing works. Alternatively, apart from the world just seeming fitting for a great will entity, if the Jester of Nihil is responsible or created by the corrupted forms of the magical girls, maybe the world at the other end of the journey being responsible for the magical girls' creation isn't too far-fetched. It could also be something as simple as the Justice Tarot? Maybe? The existence of this great will in a universe where belief in God exists is also interesting. Is the great will the god they worship, or something entirely different?
The existence of this choosing also puts into question other things that Queenie has told us. In Library of Ruina, Queenie says things like, "To keep this world's peace, I was born," and "I deserve to be everyone's hero, I was born this way." This makes it sound like Queenie was created as a magical girl, but if she was selected by the choosing to become a magical girl, then what was she beforehand? She seems to think that becoming a magical girl happens after birth because she considers asking the sinners to become magical girls in her announcer dialogue. Is she the exception, and she was made a magical girl as a baby? This dialogue could mean that she's always had a need to be someone special, even before becoming a magical girl, and being chosen gave her a chance to prove herself and live her dream. Or maybe she believes that she was always destined to be selected by the choosing because she was the chosen one from the moment she was born. Honestly, I'm not sure whether this contradiction is insight on her character, some obscure lore point we're not getting, or just an oversight. The last thing that stands out about this statement is the mention of Arcana's corrupting allure, despite being a neutral force. This allure is probably behind the gradual corruption of the magical girls and transformation into their monstrous forms.
I am eating hamburger and potato every day.
I'm using the term consumption to refer to the transformation of the magical girls as they stopped being heroes and gave in to their desires. causing destruction to the very city they were protecting. Queenie mentions characters being consumed a few times, and it probably means the same thing as a character just being corrupted or overcome by arcana. The corrupting allure that Don Quixote mentions could mean the corrupting nature of power in general, but it's more likely that arcana has a corrupting power on those who wield it. Arcana is supposedly a neutral force, so it would seem odd for arcana to inherently cause its users to become evil. However, arcana might release and grow the natural desires of its wielders, in a similar way to what we see with the magical girls, which leads to destructive behavior. Maybe the magical girls can usually handle the mental strain of arcana, when faced with great emotional disturbance of some kind, lose control as those emotions are amplified by the arcana. If this is how arcana works, you could definitely say it's more of a force of nature. There's a lot of things that point to arcana causing the consumption. The Queenie announcer says, "You'll all be corroded by arcana at this rate when the team is losing, and consumed again. But I've been trying so hard. Why does this keep happening?" when an ally dies. The magical girls are aware of the possibility of being consumed by arcana, and are actively trying to prevent it, probably among themselves and others. She also specifically uses the word corroded in this line, which might be trying to draw a parallel to ego corrosion. In ego corrosion, the wearer loses themselves in the identity and instincts of the ego they wear, which is sort of similar to how the magical girls lose sight of themselves and give in to their desires of monstrous forms when they're consumed by arcana. Additionally, when the magical girls are consumed, they grow in power. This can be seen in the difference of strength between the Queen of Hatred that attacks in her normal and snake form, When Queenie helps to suppress valve abnormalities in Love Corp, she'll sometimes say, "My senpais couldn't handle this, but I know I can." However, after suppressing the corrupted King of Greed, she says, "Senpai, if I had to face you outside, I'd totally be dead by now." This outside probably refers to King of Greed being outside of her egg. I don't think being outside of the facility would help the fish King of Greed kill a flying magical girl. This tells us that Queenie sees the hatched, consumed form of King of Greed as something much more powerful than the normal King of Greed, assuming that Queenie doesn't mean that KOG is just bad at suppressing abnormalities, or she's talking out of her ass. The idea of giving into a natural primordial force and letting yourself be corrupted to gain greater power is a pretty common story idea anyway, and would fit with consumption being connected to losing control of the arcana. In Lobotomy Corporation 2, Queenie's lines support the idea that consumption is a loss of control. Upon encountering the King of Greed, "I'm sorry, Senpai, the only thing I can do is stop your rampage," which doesn't seem to blame Greed for her actions. When she suppresses the Night of Despair, she says, "I know you tried your hardest to hold it back."
There isn't that much to go on here, but the link between the magical girls and their weapons when they are consumed is interesting. In magical girl shows, it's common for their weapons to be linked to them, or sometimes be a source of the magical girl's power. So, following that, in terms of arcana, it makes sense for magical weapons to be corrupted too when the wielder is. In the case of the magical girls, their weapons represent their values and how those values eventually turn on them. Additionally, the Jester of Nihil, who represents all of the corrupted magical girls when they're together, uses versions of their corrupted weapons to fight. It makes sense for the Jester of Nihil to replicate their fighting styles, but the Jester specifically always summons the magical girls as weapons to fight. Even the Queen of Hatred, who doesn't use any weapons in her snake form, is represented through a magical girl staff. This could just be for ease of animation, but it's something worth thinking about. I mean, wouldn't it have been really cool if the Jester summoned a snake head that fired a huge laser at the magical girls? I don't know. When the Queen of Hatred transforms, she's impaled by a ton of spears, and then her magical girl staff comes crashing down on her. The spears seem a little bit random because none of the other abnormalities use spears, and there isn't a tarot card I could find which has spears in its art. To me, this looks like a punishment. The Queen of Hatred in her hysteric state starts to doubt who she is and has thoughts that no longer wish for peace, so the Greater Will, or her staff itself, punish her and revoke her status as a magical girl. That idea feels like it fits the irony of the Queen of Hatred. Her desperation to be a hero is what results in her being rejected by the Greater Will and losing her title, so she becomes a villain. The staff represents her identity as a magical girl here. Some of the people from Lynn's server joined the server in the description, by the way. The link's right there. Go join it now. Theorize that the spheres are an imitation of the Night of Despair's attacks. Assuming that the Queen of Hatred was consumed before the Knight of Despair, which a lot of evidence points towards, it would make sense that the Knight of Despair would have been the one to put a stop to her rampage. The Knight of Despair once used her swords to protect people. When she was consumed, her swords that tended, protected, and embraced the heart instead pierced, tore, and broke it instead. Oh no! The Knight of Despair's swords represent her despair, being fueled by it and filling others with the same despair she feels. Sharing the burden will blunt the edge, quote unquote, so she gives her despair to others to escape it. When she can't give that despair to anyone, as in Ruina and Limbus, they impale her instead, breaking her. The swords represent both her pride as a knight, and how that pride drives her to despair. Woo! The King of Greed's gauntlet has a shiny gem embedded into it, that, according to the Ego Suit description, is avarice materialized. The Ego Suit itself doesn't actually have a gem on it, but we can assume that amber-colored gem it refers to is the same one as the one on King of Greed's egg and gauntlet. Ruina highlights the connection between her gauntlet and the egg with the design of her consumed form, where the gauntlet has merged with the monstrous fish egg from LobCorp. This tells us that Greed's weapon houses the happiness which became Greed and formed the gem that she eventually seals herself inside. The gauntlet also reduces the user's temperance when it's used, which makes sense since greed is excess, the opposite of temperance. Temperance is also a major arcana in tarot though. This could easily be a coincidence, but Ruina doubles down and has an abnormality page for King of Greed called Intemperance. Considering how much tarot inspiration there is in the Magical Girl background, it would be odd if there wasn't meant to be a connection here. The Korean version might not have this link to tarot cards, but it just feels very specific. The Servant of Wrath wielded a gavel, representing her desire for equity in the face of the law. When she transforms, her weapons become giant hammer arms that crush everyone equally, even allies. The acid she creates corrodes her eyes and turns innocents into the otherworldly villains she's trying to destroy. Even without her blindfold, she makes herself blind and pushes everyone away from her, alienating them. There doesn't feel like as much of a clear weapon turns on magical girl theme as the other magical girls, but they do keep making more enemies for her. Her ego gift, which turns a friend into the Hermit of the Azure Forest, does the same thing. Irony!
I touched on it a bit before, but the last thing I want to cover in this section is the order that the magical girls were consumed in. I think it's likely that the order of King of Greed, Queen of Hatred, Knight of Despair, Servant of Wrath, the same order as the phases in the Nihil fight. The first and most obvious piece of evidence for this is Knight of Despair's story, which mentioned that the people she thought would never change, Queen of Hatred and King of Greed, were consumed and became destructive. It's set in stone that Knight of Despair came after Queen of Hatred and King of Greed. Servant of Wrath isn't mentioned as having been consumed yet, but that could easily be because she wasn't in the game, or maybe not even designed yet. In-universe, that doesn't feel great, but it's fine. We pretty much know that Queen of Hatred wasn't the first magical girl to be consumed because of her lines. I'm just like her, huh? And, is it my turn now? When she goes hysteric. From there we can surmise that the magical girl she's referring to is King of Greed, because when Queen of Hatred encounters the Knight of Despair consumed, she's surprised, saying, "So you've been consumed too, senpai. Can this cycle really not be stopped?" Whereas upon encountering the consumed King of Greed, she says, "I'm sorry, senpai, the only thing I can do is stop your rampage," which sounds a lot more like Queenie already understands the position that King of Greed is in. I'm not completely sure on Servant of Wrath being the last magical girl, but her stage depicts the city in ruins, and she consistently comes last every time the magical girls appear. The Hermit arrived to destroy her world, and Servant of Wrath failed to stop her.
She just goes out there and kills me, and I can't stop her.
It would make sense for the Hermit to have bided their time until Servant of Wrath was alone, which meant that after Servant of Wrath was defeated, the Hermit actually succeeded in her mission, and would mark the end of the magical girl's story. It also feels fitting for Servant of Wrath to have been alone before she died. Her story was all about being alone and wanting a friend, and then having her only friend betray her. If any of the other magical girls had fought along her side when the Hermit arrived, then Servant of Wrath's story might have looked very different. Once all of the magical girls had been consumed, people no longer hoped or believed in anything. The only person left to talk about is...
Jester of Nihil is the major arcana of the Fool, representing, of course, nihility, the antithesis of Tifref's and the magical girl's lesson of hope. With this section, it's important to note we don't know that much about the Jester, so most of this is just speculation. We never even encounter the Jester of Nihil in any Project Moon media. The Jester of Nihil at the end of Realization of Natural Sciences in Ruiner is just Roland resonating with the Jester. The only clear information we get about the Jester of Nihil are their design, the abnormality page descriptions, Roland's resonating dialogue, and the dialogue with the librarians when they use the Jester's pages. It's hard to really draw anything from Roland's lines because they mix in a lot of his personal story, but you could take into account lines that seem to match what the Jester says elsewhere. The lines that librarians say, on the other hand, are much more reliable because they don't have any personality for the Jester of Nihil to clash with. The librarians also tend to match up much better with other things we know about whatever abnormalities page they're using. Here, we're going to go through the bits we've been given about the Jester and our own interpretations. If you have any better ideas, feel free to share them. The only detail that stands out to me in the Jester of Nihil's design is the big black leaking eyes. Eyes seem to be pretty important in the magical girls' world because all the magical girls in their consumed forms share this trait, except for the Servant of Wrath. Why is she green? The blacked out eyes might simply represent their corrosion from the arcana, since eyes are usually referred to as the windows to the soul. However, they could also represent being unaware or blind to the people around them and no longer able to learn from them. If this is what the eyes mean, then Raph isn't so different, because although she has eyes, she isn't really seeing what's around her. This idea feels like a bit of a stretch, but the tarot journey is often about learning and becoming whole as a person, while the magical girls go through the opposite process. The Jester's abnormality page lines also call attention to the idea of blindness, such as the line, "I don't know what awaits me ahead. Could it be a cliff or a ditch?" And, "blinded by carnal desires and jealousy, willingly walking to the edge of the cliff." If Jester's eyes represent naivety or despair, like the despair that the Knight of Despair gives to those she kills with her swords, then what would the huge eyes on Servant of Wrath represent? The large central eye on Servant of Wrath looks similar to the huge eye on the Hermit's cloak, and the dots around the eye are also replicated here. So then, did the Hermit's power somehow interfere with whatever is going on between the magical girls and the Jester, just for Servant of Wrath who got close to her? The large central eye is also shared by the little black bean guys that Queenie beats up in her card art. This eye could be a trait of a group of otherworlders, or maybe it represents a faction of arcana that the magical girls fight. In terms of tarot cards, the only single eye motif I could find is in certain versions of the Tower, where a single eye representing divine judgment or something watches the tower being struck down. The central eye could also represent a third eye, as in a symbol of being able to perceive beyond normal sight. The Hermit's design does have 3 eyes on her cloak, and the Servant of Wrath also has 3 eyes, although she's ironically unable to see what's really around her. The third eye is usually supposed to be on the forehead, like the Hermit's or maybe the Bean's, but Wrath's is on her chest, maybe to say she's thinking with her heart. ? The third eye isn't super related to tarot readings, but it is connected to wisdom and insight. The Jester, whose eyes are all black, seems to have the opposite of the insight that a third eye brings. The Jester is always lost, wondering, where is the right path? Where do I go? Leading the way through foolishness is not a thing to guide me, and just trust your intuition. Knowing the setting is based on tarot cards, reading, and divination, the Jester stands clearly apart from the direction and forecast of the arcana. I'm not sure what to make of the stuff with the eyes yet, so again, please tell me if you have any ideas. Okay, but really quickly, this isn't in the script at all, this is just something I wanted to bring up personally. Let's go back to the Servant of Wrath for a second, most notably the "Why is she green?" In Library of Ruiner, there's a funny little status effect called erosion. What it actually does is pretty useful, but it's not really important to what I'm going to say here. What is important is that there are 2 different types of erosion in the game that come from 2 very different places, but have the same name and the same effect. The only difference is the color. There is green erosion, which is caused by the Servant of Wrath's abnormality cards, and there is black erosion, caused by Jansegs Djolmur, also known as Enilx Mytholicistus, also known as Distorted Yarn. Now, there's a bit of a fun parallel that can be drawn between the magical girls and Yarn here. In both cases, for both sets of characters, They had ideals and ideas about how they wanted to go about their lives and the things they wanted to do. For the magical girls, well, we've already gone over those enough, but for Jan, it was trying to express his freedom of will in a city and organization that really didn't allow it. However, the magical girls end up falling apart when they realize that their ideals aren't all that they're actually cracked up to be. And it's the same with Jan. When he realizes that his attempts at expressing free will are just another cog in the city all along, and that he never had any, that causes him to distort. I'm not trying to say that arcana, corruption, and distortion is the same thing. I don't think Carmen was even around back when the magical girls were. But it's interesting to think about how there's a connection between these two seemingly completely unconnected parts of the game, yet they actually come together in their ideas really well. Thanks, Project Moon. Good job.
The Jester was once led by a brave, bright puppy, but that dog has disappeared, leaving the Jester directionless. This is probably based on the white dog in the Fool card, accompanying them at the edge of the cliff. There are a few different interpretations for what the dog means in tarot readings. Some of them say that the Fool blindly follows the dog's directions, being led off the cliff. Some say that the dog encourages the Fool to follow their instincts, but also warns of the danger ahead. The Jester is lost without the dog, and eventually ends up walking off the edge of the cliff. So in the Project Moon version, I imagine that the dog was more of a positive influence on the Jester. Despite the variations, almost every interpretation of the dog says that it in part represents the comfort of companionship and belonging. If that translates to the Jester of Nihil, then it's through the loss of that companionship that the Jester is lost to nihility and walks off the edge of the cliff. Without the dog, the Jester eventually retraces the steps of a path everybody would have taken. In that same description, it says there was no way to know if they had gathered to become the Jester, or if the Jester had come to resemble them. This is almost definitely a reference to how the Jester, as the Joker card, imitates the magical girls, or maybe the magical girls imitate the Jester. Based on that, we can probably assume that this path that the Jester is walking in reverse is the magical girl's path. Then, while retracing that path, the Jester always found itself at the end of that road. The magical girls seem to have a chicken and egg relationship based on these lines. The Jester themselves in Nihility seems to emphasize this theme of looping, with Roland's Jester resonance having the passive all returns to Nihil, and then Jatu, my beloved, saying, all roads shall converge on a path, with nothing but Nihility at its culmination in Limbus. If the Jester is retracing the path that the magical girls would have taken, then it sounds like the Jester is walking the path before the magical girls do, or the path that they would have walked if they hadn't been consumed. The passive all returns to Nihil sounds like everything originated from Nihil, so there's grounds for Nihil having been the source of the corruption like people usually like to say. However, the Jester's next abnormality page says, the Jester spake the names of everyone it had met on the path with each step it took. The next card only activates if you've also taken hatred, greed, despair, and wrath, so you can probably assume that the people that the Jester met were those already corrupted magical girls, as if the Jester was learning from them.
The tarot journey is meant to be repeated multiple times throughout someone's life, going from the Fool to the world again and again as a person finds new levels of understanding and completeness. It makes sense for that to be represented by the Jester always finding themselves back where they were. The Jester is both the beginning and the end, the source of magical girls and the product of the magical girls. In the case of the Jester of Nihil, the path was taken in reverse though, representing the degradation of the magical girl's character, moving from the world back to the Fool instead of growing as people. The tarot journey in Project Moon might not even have the world, it might also be the Jester. Would the Jester be connected to the choosing, then, or the Great Will? Queenie doesn't seem to know anything about the choosing or the Great Will, so it could be possible. The magical girls also all seem to be repeating their consumptions for some reason, so maybe the cycle's applying to all of them in a sense.
And then there's this scene in Wonderland. Why are they praying? If the prayer requires all four of them together, then that surely calls to mind the Jester of Nihil, kind of like an Apocalypse Bird-style boss. When the magical girls gather together, they resemble the Jester, so does this mean that the magical girls are trying to summon it? In this scene, the magical girls haven't lost their minds or been consumed yet, so they probably think that summoning the Jester would have some kind of positive result, or maybe help them. Maybe by summoning the Jester, they would be able to free themselves from whatever cycle they're experiencing, just like how they come to terms with themselves during the realization of natural sciences and become real magical girls again. I can't tell if the magical girls are struggling with some cycle or not. The only mention I've seen of any kind of loop is when Queenie sees that the Knight of Despair has been consumed, and says, "So you've been consumed too, senpai. Can the cycle really not be stopped?" This could just be referring to the cycle of faith and betrayal that the Knight of Despair goes through, though it is odd that Queenie specifically says this about the consumption. Maybe somehow the Queen of Hatred does know about the Knight being consumed again and again, maybe during one of her periods of non-corruption that she has for some reason. In Terror, the word cycle is sometimes used to mean the journey from Fool to Terror, a lesson or major part of your life which will repeat again and again until you learn from it. If the Jester's blacked-out eyes do represent this inability to learn, especially from its own mistakes, then the Jester and the magical girls would not be able to move on from this cycle. I think this is what the magical girls face, repeating their corrosions again and again until they face Nihility, who unknowingly represents all of the reverse values they embodied, and overcoming it by learning hope.
The cliff in the Jester story might be this ending that they're all searching for. The cliff is present in the Fool's art too, and would usually be the end of a path instead of the beginning. If the Jester always returns to the path every time they walk down it, then what happens when the Jester, blinded by carnal desire and jealousy, willingly walks to the edge of the cliff? This quote comes from the card Nyx, which is the gathering of all the corrupted magical girls, where everybody's agony becomes one. The carnal desires are the hatred, greed, despair, and wrath that the Jester speaks. For some reason, this quote also mentions jealousy. Why is that? Was the Jester jealous of the magical girls for some reason? If the Jester embodied the negative traits prior to the magical girls' corruptions, would they have been generous of their heroic spirits? This quote might also apply not just to the Jester, but also the magical girls themselves, just since they keep pointing out how the Jester and magical girls are one and the same, especially with this card where their agony joins as one. I think that probably means that the Jester walking to the edge of the cliff is when the magical girls gather and the Jester appears, marking the end of the cycles. This is all super wishy-washy and speculative, but I'm not really sure what to make of it, and I'm pretty happy with this idea narratively. BLEGHHHHHHHHHH. Why is that in the script?
This, I think, properly demonstrates why Rudolta is the best magical girl, the magical girl of Jolly. Thank you all so much for watching, England, and have a good night.
That's why your shoes raggedy.
That's why our mama dead. Dead as hell. What shoes she got on? What shoes she got on her casket? That's
Get
why your
out of
granny
my
ain't got no
car.
knees, cause she can't pray to Jesus.
Get out of my car.